Welcome to Jehovah's Witnesses Today. I'm Leonard Credian, producer of this series of video profiles about the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses. This series is designed to inform and update you on what is happening within this controversial sect today. Today we have with us Dr. Jerry Bergman, a professor and a former Jehovah's Witness. Jerry is going to share with us his experiences as both a overseer, pioneer within the Jehovah's Witness organization, and also as an individual that worked in various mental health clinics. He's going to share with us some of his experiences that fall into the area of mental illness and emotional distress amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. These are first-hand experiences, of course, that Jerry has gained over the years, and he's not only going to tell us about some of the effects that the witness experience has had on individuals, but he's also going to share with us some things, some information that can help us in dealing with these persons that have become victims, really, in many respects. Jerry, the first question I wanted to ask you today is, we talk about mental health, and we think, what could we say is the basic primary element that we could use to determine a person's mental health?
Well, probably the basic definition of mental health is, are you happy, and are you able to adjust and deal with the various problems that one encounters in life? Can you deal with the traumas that all of us experience? And mental health, of course, is a major concern in this society today. And it's especially of major concern to me because of my working with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I've discovered that there are many serious mental health problems, and these are quite common. They're not exceptional. In fact, I found about 10% of the average congregation is in serious need of some type of therapy. So we're not talking about a small number. We're talking about a fairly large number. And that means that these people are not at all happy, that they're suicidal. They're simply not able to deal with normal day-to-day problems that we all encounter.
The experience that you had, Jerry, is not too unlike many of the experiences that other individuals. I was an elder myself, and I do know what you're speaking about with respect to the emotional distress and so forth that Jehovah's Witnesses experience. But you did have a more, a wider, if you will, experience in dealing with this mental illness and emotional distress that we'd like really you to elaborate on a little bit. Could you just tell us a little bit how it was that you ended up getting this unique insight into the problem, into the situation?
Well, one of the major areas of study in college was psychology. And in studying psychology, I naturally took an interest in people. And when I became a servant in the congregation that I was affiliated with, I began to deal more and more with the problems that the witnesses had. And I began to realize that the problems that they experienced were, first of all, not small, and secondly, they were far more common than I thought they would be. Most witnesses, I think, believe that Jehovah's Witnesses are pretty well free of emotional problems, that they're very rare, they're very uncommon. And I discovered as time went on that they were anything but uncommon. And later on, I began to work for various mental health clinics. I also taught psychology at the college level. I was an associate professor of psychology at a college, and this exposed me to the problems. I also have done quite a bit of research on the problems of mental illness among the witnesses, and I found that other researchers found the same thing I did, namely that these problems were very serious and very common. And my experience, I think, caused me to try to show concern, to try to deal with this problem. And I dealt with it at first by trying to help individual witnesses who I perceived needed help. And of course, my work with a clinic, they came to me and they sought out help. So in my employment at the clinic, then I was assigned to deal with those Jehovah's Witnesses that came to the clinic. Also in my work in the congregation, I was in essence assigned to try to help those individuals who experience these problems, because the other servants in the congregation realized I had this background and so they naturally assigned me or had asked me to intervene in the cases where they felt they couldn't adequately deal with.
Jerry, we realize that you had these experiences, of course, and obviously had considerable empathy for the Jehovah's Witnesses that were in your congregation as you worked with them. How was it, though, that you got involved with them in the sort of mental health clinic level? Could you tell us about that, please?
Well, I was employed for these various mental health clinics, both in a research capacity and both as a therapist. And so my job, my livelihood, was essentially doing therapy. And in this role, I was able to work with many witnesses. And of course, I had a special interest in working with witnesses. And the director of the clinic knew this, and he assigned to me clients that had a witness background. We had an intake system where they were evaluated, and then after the evaluation occurred, we then assigned them to the therapist that we felt they were best suited to work with. And thus, in my employment role, I worked in this capacity.
Within the framework, Jerry, of course, of the congregation, and then later on, and coinciding with that, when you were doing your work in the mental health clinic, what would you find, if we could sort of do an overall framework, what did you find was your overall findings? In other words, what were the elements of distress and so on? What were these things that seemed to keep emerging as the standard amongst them?
Well, probably the most common problem that I encountered was essentially many witnesses I worked with were very depressed. They had no goal or purpose in life. They were very devoted witnesses, but yet saw the new world as being somewhat illusionary. And they, in many cases, deferred what most normal people want to do. For example, going to college, a career, developing their artistic talents, developing other interests that they had. And witnesses seem to live a life forever on hold. And they can do that for a while. But after 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 years, it gets rather difficult to live your life on hold. And many felt guilty about their depression. They felt guilty about the problems that they were experiencing. Many felt, as a witness, I shouldn't experience these problems, but yet they were. And aside from this, I think a lot had a great deal of guilt about desires they had. I had one client that told me that she was very guilty because she liked to listen to classical music, and she felt this was wrong because she realized that much of this music was composed for the church, for use in the church. And so her liking of Beethoven, Bach, and so on, she felt guilty about this. So witnesses, I find, have a tremendous amount to feel guilty about. And so depression, guilt, self-doubt, and also I think many of them have serious doubts about the validity of the Watchtower Society. Many of them strongly believe the Watchtower Society is God's organization, but many have questions and doubts. And these doubts, I think, cause them a lot of problems. They nag at them, so to speak. And because of their doubts about the Watchtower Society, I think they question whether they're wasting their life. And this can be a scary thought. If you're devoting your whole life to an organization like the Watchtower, just the fleeting thought that maybe I'm wasting my life doing something that is foolish, or maybe I'm giving my life to an organization that's wrong, this can be very scary. And these doubts, I think, nag at them over and over until finally they break out, so to speak, in serious emotional problems, guilt, depression. I had a lot of obsessive-compulsive people I worked with, which I think stems from the guilt trip that the Watchtower organization puts on people.
As an elder, Jerry, I recall myself over the years many times handling some pretty odd cases and so forth. But you know, it always seemed that the advice that the society gave us was that the problem wasn't within the person so much in terms of these external things we're speaking about, but it was probably a spiritual problem, that they weren't studying enough, that they needed to study more. And the study usually revolved around some society publication and not really the Bible, as it were. I have caught, however, in recent Watchtower publications a slightly different tone. I'm starting to read articles that indicate to me that the society is beginning to face and understand that, yes, indeed, there are emotional problems amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. Have you found this to be the case in your readings? And you really, in certain respects, were a pioneer in all of this. Did you ever bring this to the attention of, say, the Watchtower officials and so on? What was their reaction to this information?
Yes, I've noticed this very same thing myself. It seemed at first when I began to work with witnesses in this capacity that the society would fight against what was necessary to help them. They would seem to counteract the therapy that was needed in order to help these people adjust and become mentally healthy. And I often noted that this was occurring and talked to a number of governing body officials like Brother Schroeder and several others about this. And I'm not sure that they listened carefully to what I said, but I think what I had to say did have an impact upon them. And probably, too, what happened was they received reports throughout the world of suicides, of severe emotional problems our witnesses were having, and I think it became very apparent to them that there were many very serious, emotionally ill people in the organization. And we're not just talking about persons at the lower level. We're talking about circuit overseers, and I understand several members of the governing body had serious emotional problems. So I think after a while they could no longer deny it. They realized that these problems were there, and they had to deal with them. And also in my writing, I've written several journal articles. I've written a book on this topic. I've also written a number of other papers. And I usually sent copies of these to individuals at the Watchtower Society. And although they never directly stated to me that these influenced them, I have a hard time feeling that they didn't. And I'm sure there are others who are sending similar reports to the society. There is an individual who likewise was a witness out in another state that I lived in, and he, I understand, wrote a paper on the very same topic I did, on the mental health problems. And he sent a copy to the society and personally talked to a number of individuals there as well. And I think from so many angles, this information saying the same thing was coming forth, that they realized they had to deal with it. And I think now they are trying to, in some way at least, deal with these problems. They can no longer ignore them because they are so serious and so widespread. And so they are making some efforts to deal with them, but I think the basic problems are still there. They still send witnesses on a guilt trip. They still ask you to put your life on hold. They still ask you to live in what, in many ways, is a very abnormal world. And if you look at the witness world very carefully, one wonders why people would not go insane living in this world, or at least not have emotional problems. It's a very abnormal world. And so they are acknowledging these things, but in a very small way, I believe. I believe what they are doing is a drop in the bucket. It's a penny in the sea of dollars that needs to be looked at. So what they will do in the future is hard to say. They still tend to believe if you pray more, study more, go out in service, all your problems will disappear. This still tends to be the major teaching. Although they do recognize, well, in some cases, maybe antidepressants would be appropriate. In some cases, maybe a vacation would be appropriate. And maybe it's not wrong now, they're saying, to go to a 2-year technical college. That was condemned, college was, for years. Now they're saying, well, maybe a 2-year technical college would not be that bad. It's still wrong to go to a college, and of course wrong to go to a university, but maybe a couple years of schooling is okay. So there is some flexibility now, which there was not before. But ironically, in other areas, there's more rigidity. So they seem to deal effectively in some areas, but in other areas, they take 2 or 3 steps backward and seem to contribute more to the problems they have.
Jerry, you know, it's interesting as we sit here and talk about these things, and I've read a variety of papers, and I know that you have access to far more things than I've probably read. In corroboration of the things we're talking about, what have other researchers actually developed? What have they come up with? Anything different, or is it just a total corroboration of what we're speaking about here today?
Well, I've reviewed quite a bit of research on the witnesses, and in this area especially, and I found all the studies that I consulted found exactly the same thing.